I'm so stoked because today we are going to be talking about the Backrooms. Finally got to go check it out, and I can't wait to dive into it. I'd love to hear some of your feedback. So after the video, if you have seen this already and have your own thoughts, please leave them in the comments because I'd love to hear everyone else's theories. The ending is a little left open ended, and I've loved to hear different things that people have had to say about that. So, why don't we let's just hop right into it. I really want to talk about liminal spaces. A liminal space, for anyone that doesn't know, is a place that exists between destinations, empty hallways, abandoned malls, school corridors after everyone goes home, places that should be full of life, but somehow feel wrong when they're empty, if that makes sense. The reason liminal spaces scare us isn't that they're always dangerous, it's because they're familiar. We recognize them. The yellow wallpaper, the fluorescent light, the endless office corridors, everything feels like somewhere we've been before. Yet at the same time, it feels completely alien. Our brains are constantly searching for context and meaning, but liminal spaces kind of deny us both. The Backrooms takes this concept to the extreme. It traps people inside of a place that feels recognizable while stripping away every single marker that tells us who we are, where we are, or how to escape. In many ways, that's what makes the film so effective. The monster isn't the scariest thing in the movie. It's the feeling of being lost, being watched, not just physically, but also existentially. And that brings us to Clark. So from this point on, there are going to be major spoilers. Once again, I hate to get into spoilers, but for this movie, it's kind of impossible not to if I want to talk about a lot of what I want to talk about. So from here on out, major spoiler warning. Okay, so Clark's descent into the Backrooms. At first, Clark approaches the Backrooms kind of like a problem to be solved. He's confident, dismissive, convinced that he can control the situation, even after members of his own team, his employees start dying. He continues pushing forward. But once Clark becomes isolated, that is when the film starts to really take a shift. The Backrooms stops feeling like a location and it begins feeling like a reflection of Clark's inner world. As he wanders the endless hallways, separated from reality and haunted by the consequences of his choices, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell whether Clark is discovering hidden truths or simply just losing grip of reality. The most fascinating interpretation is that the Backrooms force Clark into a confrontation with himself. For perhaps the first time in his life, he is unable to blame anyone else. His employees are dead. His plan has failed. His confidence has slowly collapsed. And all that's left is Clark and the consequences of his actions, which he finally must face for himself. Throughout the film, there are moments where it feels like Clark is on the verge of accepting responsibility for who he has become and how he got there, almost as if the backrooms are offering him a chance at self awareness and maybe even a little self redemption. But he never fully takes it. Instead, he repeatedly retreats into the same selfish patterns that brought him to the backrooms in the first place, which makes the ending especially interesting. The film never clearly explains what happens when the main entity takes Clark. Yes, we may see Clark hurt. We saw him get a good little chunk taken out from the neck area. And we may see the entity dragging him some with some blood and whatnot. But that does not necessarily mean he is dead. Personally, I don't think that the ending is really about what the entity does with Clark. I think it's about what Clark refuses to do for himself. The entity becomes a physical manifestation of the truth he spent the entire film avoiding. And rather than face that truth, he surrenders to it. The backrooms may be endless hallways and impossible spaces, but for Clark, they become something much more terrifying. A place where he can no longer run from himself. Which now brings us to Mary's journey. We find out that Mary is Clark's therapist in the real world. And once Clark has been missing for a while, Mary takes it upon herself to see if she can find out where he's at, what he's been up to. So we get flashback scenes from Mary's childhood, different things like that. We're not exactly sure what kind of trauma she endured, but there is definitely some family and childhood issues that she's not quite worked through herself yet. Mary is basically trapped by the past, while Clark spends much of the film avoiding accountability. Mary represents a different response to trauma. Throughout the film, we learn pieces of Mary's childhood and begin to understand that she carries a tremendous amount of emotional baggage into the backrooms. Unlike Clark, who seems determined to control every situation, Mary often feels stuck between fear, uncertainty, and like self doubt. And that's what makes her so compelling. The backrooms don't just expose our flaws, they expose the stories we tell ourselves. For Clark, that story is that everyone else is responsible for all of his problems. For Mary, the story seems to be that she's trapped by herself. She wanders through the endless halls. Mary's journey becomes less about escaping a physical location and more about confronting the emotional wounds that she has carried since her childhood. She begins to recognize that the pain she experienced shaped her, but it doesn't have to define her. One of the film's most powerful ideas is that understanding why we are the way we are is not the same. It is not the same as excusing our behavior. Mary comes to realize that her childhood explains many of her fears, insecurities, and struggles. It helps her to understand herself. But understanding isn't freedom. Freedom still requires action. It requires choosing what comes next. And that is where Mary's story becomes so relatable because many of us have had moments where we recognize the patterns that held us back. We can identify them. We can trace them back to the original source. We know exactly why we react the way we do. Yet somehow we remain stuck. not because we don't understand ourselves, but because change, it truly is terrifying. The backrooms themselves became a perfect metaphor for this fear. Every hallway leads somewhere unfamiliar. Every turn forces a choice. There's no map, no certainty, and no guarantee that the next door will be better than the last. And Mary's struggle feels deeply human because she understands that she cannot stay where she is, yet she remains terrified of what lies ahead of her. The film suggests that healing isn't simply about recognizing what happened to us. It's about accepting responsibility for what we do with that pain. Not that we take responsibility for the wounds themselves, but instead we take the responsibility for what comes next. In that sense, Mary and Clark are mirror images of one another. Clark's refusal to acknowledge his role in shaping his future is crucial to his storyline and his character. Whereas Mary goes the opposite way. She acknowledges it, but fears she may not be strong enough to change it. Both are trapped, both are lost, but only one of them seems willing to face the truth. And that ultimately means that only one of them makes it out alive. Liminal spaces aren't just physical locations, they're seasons of life where who we were no longer works, but we don't yet know who we're becoming. So, one last thought. What I really like about this interpretation is that it connects directly back to the liminal space theme. A liminal space is neither where you were nor where you're going. Mary lives in that space emotionally. She understands her past, but she hasn't fully stepped into her future. She's standing in the doorway, frozen between who she was and who she could become. That's why the backrooms feel like such a fitting setting specifically for her story. The endless hallways aren't just a maze, they're a representation of what it feels like to be caught between fear and transformation. And honestly, that theme is probably why so many people connect with backroom stories in the first place. Most of us know what it feels like to be stuck in a season where we can't go back, but we're terrified to move forward. And that's the real horror underneath all the monsters and fluorescent lights. The horror of the backrooms isn't that there might be a monster waiting around the corner next. The horror is that eventually we're forced to confront ourselves. The endless hallways, empty rooms, impossible spaces reflect something deeply human. Those seasons of life where we can no longer return to who we were, but we're terrified of becoming someone new. Clark and Mary responded to that reality in very different ways. One refuses to change, and the other fears change, but eventually recognizes that it is necessary. And maybe that's why the backrooms continues to fascinate people. Beneath all the lore, monsters, and mysteries is a simple question. What happens when we're finally trapped with the one person that we can never escape? Ourselves. So, before I hop off here, I'd love to give you a quick rating of what I think the movie deserves. I teetered back and forth between an 8.5 and a 9 for this one because I thought it was done very well. I ultimately chose an 8.5 out of 10 just for very few little flaws I saw. A couple of the character decisions were not the best. few continuity issues, but other than that, seriously, not a whole lot to complain about. So go check it out. Backrooms, it's still in theaters. Fantastic. Especially if you love liminal spaces, analog horror, anything similar to that, you're going to want to check this movie out. Well, don't forget to subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.